Good afternoon. My name's Julia Chisholm, and I'm a consultant paediatric oncologist at the Royal Marsden Hospital in London. And I'm also the current chair of the National Cancer Research Institute Children's Research Group. It's a great pleasure to be here today at the first collaborative conference between the CCLG and the NCRI Children's Group. And it's my job to talk about childhood cancer research in the UK. How does it work? So this got me thinking, well, how do we define research in the first place? So I looked up in the short Oxford English Dictionary, and here the definition of research is a search or investigation undertaken to discover facts and reach new conclusions by the critical study of a subject or by a course of scientific inquiry. So it's not that precise, and it covers many different things. So when we think about children's cancer research, we often think about treatment trials, and of course they're very important and they're central to a lot of what we do. But we may be doing lab science, linking into our treatment trials. So looking at tumor biology, looking at drug targets, looking at drug testing, trying to understand how drugs tested in the laboratory might work in humans. And these aspects, as I say, are very important and link in with our treatment trials. But we may be doing research into supportive care, into quality of life, into the side effects of treatment, into how to deliver services, health services research. Data is becoming increasingly important in all that we do. We have very large data sets these days from the laboratory and also clinical data sets. So the analysis of data sets, the use of big data, the emerging use of AI, these are all very important. And these different areas of research sort of interact, so they're not distinct from each other, but they interact with each other so that, for example, you may have supportive care or quality of life or side effects studied within the context of a main treatment trial, which is also linking with our biology colleagues as well. When we think of the types of clinical cancer research, in adults, prevention and screening trials are important, but not so much in children. Pilot studies or feasibility studies, again, less important in children than in adults. And our main clinical studies in children are treatment trials. So we call these by their phase, as you may know. So phase 1 studies are dose finding studies where we're trying to find what dose of drug we can safely use either by itself or in combination with other drugs. And we're looking at the side effects and safety of that drug. And these are very often run by pharma companies who are the manufacturers of the drugs. In phase 2 studies, we know what dose of drug or combination of drugs to use, and we're looking for the effectiveness and getting more data on the side effects of treatment. Phase 3 studies are often considered the gold standard. These are often randomized studies where we're comparing 2 different treatments against each other, or perhaps more than 2 treatments against each other. And these studies will be the definitive studies that we do in larger numbers of patients that help us to decide on what the best treatments are to take forward. Phase 4 studies are post-licensing studies, which we do sometimes do in children, but are much more common in adults. Now, all these types of treatment trials interact with biological specimens and biological studies as well. So we may be collecting samples to look at tumor biology, or it may be that tumor biology is being studied and it helps us to decide which treatment groups to put the patients in. We may be looking at biomarkers that predict response to treatment, or biomarkers that show response to treatment, or biomarkers that tell us which patients to put in which treatment group. And we may be looking at pharmacokinetics, that's blood samples usually, to know how drugs are handled within the body. So our main thing is treatment trials, but observational studies can be very important, and these can be embedded within treatment trials as well. There may be cohort studies where we're looking at a specific group of patients over a period of time. Maybe case control studies where we comparing our cancer patients with matched case controls to look at differences in outcomes or differences in toxicities or something like that between the different groups. Or maybe cross-sectional studies where we're studying a group of patients at a particular point in time. Now, in this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the treatment trials and primarily on what we call academic sponsored trials rather than pharma sponsored trials. But we'll be highlighting again the importance of biology and specimens and biomarkers and drug handling as we go along. So some important considerations for childhood cancer research. So childhood cancer is rare. There are about 1,800 patients per year under the age of 15 diagnosed with cancer in the UK. And if you think cancer is rare, then individual cancer types are even rarer. And that means that treatment trials require international collaboration. So historically, we've been able to run our own trials for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is the commonest single tumor type that we see in children. But even that now, we're part of an international consortium. We have run our own trials in Wilms tumors, but now we're doing that with our European colleagues. And pretty much all other pediatric tumor types, we need to take part in international trials in order to have sufficient numbers of patients to be able to answer the important questions that we want to do. Tumor biology is now integral to our clinical trials. It can guide our treatment, and we may want to collect samples for future research and to perhaps understand, for example, which patients have responded to the treatment in the trial that we've just run. And we have the challenge of integrating genomics. So genetic understanding comes from things like whole exome sequencing, which is now standard of care for children with cancer, the next generation sequencing panels and methylation panels that are now standard of care for our patients, and the relapse SMP study. And by understanding the genomic aspects of tumors, we can then understand how to implement precision medicine in children. But this is an area where there's still a long way to go with the integration. This is just to demonstrate the relative frequency of different children's cancers. In the UK, leukemias are the commonest, followed by brain and spinal tumors, which are quite a disparate group. Then the lymphomas, particularly Hodgkin's lymphoma and the non-Hodgkin's lymphomas, and the soft tissue sarcomas, which are again a disparate group, with about 2/3 being Rhabdomyosarcoma. And then we get into neuroblastoma, kidney tumors, and so on. So just to show that numbers are small. And so that's why we need to do international trials. So how does it work? Well, I'm going to go through generically how we get trials going in the UK and how they're run. And I'm going to use some examples from Rhabdomyosarcoma, and that seemed pertinent, partly because that's the area that I work in, but also the next talk is around the new Rhabdomyosarcoma study. So it feeds into that as well. So if you're trying to get a trial together, the first point is to have a good idea, or more scientifically put, that would be deciding the main trial questions. Now, an example from the world of Rhabdomyosarcoma. Currently, there are two main groups running trials in Rhabdomyosarcoma: the European Paediatric Soft Tissue Sarcoma group that we're part of here in the UK, and the Children's Oncology group, which covers North America and Canada, and a few other countries that join in with that. And we know each other in these groups. We're in constant dialogue. We go to each other's meetings and we talk about emerging results between us. But in the EPSSG, when we're thinking about our next set of EPSSG studies, we look at what we've just done. And in Rhabdomyosarcoma, we've had 3 recent trials: the FaR-RMS 2005 trial in localized disease, the MTS 2008 trial in metastatic disease, and the BIT 0910 study in relapse disease. And we review the results of the trials as they emerge. We review published data. We talk to our colleagues in COG. We ask questions like, where do we want to do better? And what do we want to find out? And as we ask those questions, we begin to see what the key questions will be for the next trial. And we therefore begin to develop a proposal. So in the proposal, the first thing to do is to refine the main trial questions. Which patients? In Rhabdomyosarcoma, the next study has all patients of all ages with pediatric type Rhabdomyosarcoma, whether they're newly diagnosed or whether they're relapsed. Which treatments are we interested in running trial questions on? So again, in the Rhabdomyosarcoma study, it's chemotherapy questions, radiotherapy questions, and targeted therapy questions. Which biological questions are we interested in? So for example, in the Rhabdomyosarcoma study, we are looking at whether we can accurately risk stratify patients by looking at the presence or absence of a particular gene fusion that we see in Rhabdomyosarcoma. Well, the other key questions, well, for example, in the Rhabdomyosarcoma study, we're looking at the role of response by PET-CT scan in predicting outcome of treatment. And do we need tissue or tumor samples, and what would that be for? So again, in the Rhabdomyosarcoma study, we're doing central pathology review. We're collecting tumor samples for ongoing research and future research. And we want to study tumour DNA in blood through liquid biopsies, blood samples that might help us to know whether patients respond. We can monitor response to treatment by blood samples, or whether we can predict relapse of tumour by blood samples rather than by scans. So there's just some examples of the kinds of things we're looking for. So we refine the questions, we define the leadership. So there has to be international trial leadership for an international trial. There'll always be one chief investigator, but there'll be leadership covering all the different disciplines represented within the study. So for example, systemic therapy, chemotherapy, surgery, radiotherapy, biological questions, pathological questions, and really importantly, the statisticians. And these will typically be drawn from different countries represented within the particular cooperative working group. And that can take quite a bit of negotiation to make sure that we get it fair. And then we need to decide on leadership for each country. There'll be one national coordinating investigator for each country, and that'll be important for the study conduct going forward. So we've agreed our leadership, but we also need to agree the sponsorship. So every study will have one international sponsor. Every international study will have one international sponsor, but each country has to have a national coordinating centre to coordinate the conduct of that study in the individual country. So for example, with the Rhabdomyosarcoma study, it's the University of Birmingham Clinical Trials Unit. That is the international sponsor, but there will be a national coordinating centre in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Holland, and so on. The sponsor has the responsibility for initiation, management, and financing, or arranging financing for the trial, but importantly has very specific legal responsibilities under current clinical trials regulations. And the sponsor must define, establish, and allocate all trial-related duties and functions. So you've got your questions, you've got your leadership, you've got your sponsor, but you need to then ensure that all the countries are on board. So we need to discuss trial design, national leadership, and the national coordinating centre in each country. And this is where I'm going to move to the UK and tell you how that works in the UK. So we have the National Cancer Research Institute, which is a partnership of UK cancer research funders. So the charities are shown here, the health departments are shown here, Research Council shown here, and the Industry Partner Association of British Pharmaceutical Industries. And these partners work together with researchers and consumers or PPI members within NCRI to develop and establish a comprehensive portfolio of clinical trials. This is run primarily through the research groups of NCRI. So there are site-specific research groups such as breast and prostate. We have a children's research group that covers the main types of children's cancers, and each of these groups has to develop and maintain a comprehensive national portfolio of clinical trials and other well-designed studies to encourage bench to bedside, that's translational research in the trial portfolio, and enhance its potential for personalised medicine, to liaise with funding bodies and to consider the views and advice provided by consumer representatives. I think now we're trying to make consumer input integral into all that we do. So our children's research group has a main group which has multi-professional representation on it that covers the majority of key children's tumours. Some of our funding partners, such as Cancer Research UK, obviously NCRI members, but for example, the Children's Cancer and Leukemia Group is represented on the NCRI Children's Group. And within the Children's Group, we have 6 main subgroups that cover some of the important tumour types, but because we don't cover everything within the Children's Research Group, we have close links to the sarcoma subgroup called YOS, Young Onset Soft Tissue Sarcoma, which covers off the soft tissue sarcomas, and within the sarcoma research group, we have links to the Hodgkin subgroup of the lymphoma research group, and we have links to the CCLG special interest groups. So the renal tumours work, LCH, Langerhans cell histiocytosis, supportive care research portfolio is managed within the special interest groups because we don't have that specific representation within the NCRI Children's Group. And there's a whole story behind that that we won't go into right now. But in terms of maintaining trial portfolio, the tumour-specific groups are really key to this, understanding what's going on at a national level and more importantly at an international level. representing the UK in the different international working groups, and being involved in dialogue around the development of international trials, and then bringing them back to the subgroups for discussion. And there's sort of a two-way dialogue, if you like, between the national groups and the international groups in terms of refining the trial design. And once the trial design is fairly well refined, it will come to the main children's research group for further discussion. And sometimes we can make really helpful suggestions because we have a slightly different, more broad perspective there. And once we've agreed to support a study, then we can write letters to the funders to support the funding applications for those studies. Which brings us to funding, because no study will happen without funding, and we need funding for international sponsorship when a country is the international sponsor, and we'll need funding for national coordination in each country. Typically, each country will need to find its own money for national coordination, and there may need to be money for trial-related drugs or trial-related procedures such as scans. So it's the responsibility of the sponsor or the national coordinating sponsor, national coordinating centre, to ensure that there's money at national level to run the study. And in the UK, our main UK cancer clinical trials funder is Cancer Research UK, so that's both for adult studies and for childhood studies as well. But there are other sources, and the National Institute of Health Research, various charities, and the Children's Cancer and Leukemia Group with the Little Princess Trust are all able to fund trials or parts of trials. And we've got our new high-risk neuroblastoma study that's being funded by two different charities coming together to provide the funding, because the actual sums for funding a trial are really quite significant, 2.3 million, I think, for the new Rhabdomyosarcoma study just to run that in the UK and for international sponsorship. So once we've got agreement on funding, there's a lot of work to do to get the trial open. So we need to write the protocol, and the sponsor will help us with that. We need to obtain regulatory approvals. So in the UK, that's the MHRA for drugs and the Research Ethics Committee for the ethical aspects of the trial. And once we've got the national approvals, we're able to look for local R&D approvals. And all this will be going on. We're supposed to have a study open within a year of funding if it's a CR UK funded study. And the sponsor will be establishing all of these processes, and the sites will be preparing to open towards the end of this process. In terms of trial delivery, I've put this slide in just to draw a point, because the NCRI is really about developing and maintaining a portfolio of trials, but not about delivering the trials. And the UK trial delivery is through the National Clinical Research Network, the NCRN. So this has government funding to support research delivery. So, for example, data managers, research nurses, and the NCRN has a number of local research networks that work with their local provider trusts, hospitals like the Royal Marsden and others, to provide support to get trials actually running and delivered in individual centres. But there is a link back, because the NCRI developed trials are adopted into the NCRN portfolio, and they don't have to come through NCRI. Other trials can be adopted in too. But we are measured in the NCRI by the number of patients recruited to portfolio trials. So delivery and development are separate, but they're also interlinked. In terms of trial governance, all trial work must follow International Conference on Harmonisation Good Clinical Practice guidelines, that's ICH GCP guidelines. And this is an ethical and scientific quality standard for designing, conducting, recording and reporting trials that involve the participation of human subjects. An important part of that is adverse event reporting and serious adverse event reporting, also known as pharmacovigilance, to ensure safety around the drugs or treatments being used in the trial. Each trial will have a trial management group made up, for example, of the national coordinators and members of the sponsor organisation. There's a trial steering committee that has oversight of the trial and provides advice on trial conduct. And really importantly, every trial has a data safety monitoring committee, which stands independent of the trial and is responsible for ensuring the safety, if you like, of subjects within the trial through data monitoring and reporting back and raising concerns if they emerge. So that brings us to the patients and the data. So once the study has been all through the national approvals and it's got local approval in a site, then we can start to recruit patients. So we approach the patients, we take consent, we screen the patients, we'll randomize them if that's a randomized trial question, or they'll start their treatment. And during their treatment, we may need to collect samples from them, blood, tissue, or whatever, for biological and biomarker and pharmacokinetic studies. From the patients in the study, we'll be collecting data and returning it to the trial sponsor. But there's a process of monitoring that goes on, whereby the data, or some of the data, is checked for accuracy, any issues are resolved. And this is part of due diligence, if you like, to ensure that the data that is returned on patients is thoroughly accurate, because the data outputs are completely dependent on accurate data inputs. So the statisticians in the trial are monitoring the data that's coming in. They're providing reports to the Data Safety Monitoring Committee, who are reviewing the safety of the trial at regular intervals as things go along, and will feed back any concerns into the trial steering group. And in this way, the trial continues, but in a way where things are carefully monitored and safety it remains paramount. And so as the trial goes through, we begin to start getting data out of the trial. Obviously, it has to be at a stage where it's ready to be released and it's safe to be released. But this is looking into the future. We will be getting data from the FaR-RMS study, the Rhabdomyosarcoma study, in due course, not yet because we're still some way off. But as we begin to get data that is in the public domain, or at least in the domain of the trial organisers, we can begin to review the results. We can review how that goes with published data. We're still in dialogue with our other international colleagues, and we start asking the questions: where do we want to do better? What do we want to find out? So that as one trial is getting towards the end, we're beginning to think about what the next trial is going to look like. Where do patients come in and parents? Well, a number of our international consortia have international parent groups. So in the Rhabdomyosarcoma world, we have the EPSSG parent group. There's a trial steering group for each trial, and we have parents involved in our EPSSG trial steering groups, and the parent groups can review patient information sheets. That can happen at international level, and it can also happen at national level, organisations like the UK Port. Obviously, there are national parent groups, and like Port, and these can be involved. And then there are the NCRI groups. So the NCRI research groups and each of the subgroups have consumer members, parents or patients, depending on what's appropriate. And the consumers involved in NCRI are able to take part in an active consumer forum where they receive training and education information that helps them to fulfill their PPI roles, if you like, within the research groups and subgroups. Parents can be involved in fundraising for clinical research or for laboratory research, and they can be involved in the funding committees that are deciding who to award research grants to. And then very finally, another way that parents and patients can support research was just demonstrated recently through our FaR-RMS logo project. So this is a new Rhabdomyosarcoma study where we undertook a piece of work that involved young people who were cancer survivors working with a mother of a child with Rhabdomyosarcoma who also heads up a Rhabdomyosarcoma charity. And this group together designed a design brief, and then produced some designs, some by a graphic designer and some by an aspiring graphic designer who was a young person, a young adult cancer survivor who was an aspiring graphic designer who actually would produce this winning logo here. So this is a tree signifying hope. The trunk is like a wishbone, hoping for good luck. The colours of the leaves represent the different stakeholders in the trial: parents, patients, health professionals. And the leaves are blasting out from the centre, representing the ability of this treatment to blast the cancer away. So trials are complex, but there are little bits of them that can be fun, as I've just shown you. So thank you for listening today. Look forward to taking any questions in our feedback session later on.